Hey, my friends, welcome back to Staying Strong for Marriages, a YouTube channel dedicated to helping people go through marriage separation or divorce, recovering using Christian principles, hoping to see marriage restorations. I love this idea. A lot of the reason that I even got into this line of thinking was due to this ministry that I've talked about before called Rejoice Marriage Ministries. They are really one of my favorites. I did a whole video just covering them. But I got an email today. Like I said, you can sign up for their daily emails and get all kinds of encouragement, different insights. One of the reasons why I really like them is because they do a lot of things really well. They also do some things that I haven't seen anyone else doing. So anybody that considers to continue to fight for what they believe in and to consider loving through what seems to be hopeless situations, it's amazing. Look, I married a great woman. I'm a great guy, and I'm not ashamed to say that. I think that one of the temptations people will try to say, oh, well, we're just not any good. People will give us this message all the time. Or if you consider waiting and standing for your marriage, people will say something that's like, the words say, wow, you must really love them, but the meaning conveyed is, wow, you're really like kind of pathetic. You should just marry somebody else. I think that that is actually all nonsense. And I want to show you something today that I think gives us a different message, one that we don't hear very often about marriage being sacred, marriage being worth fighting for. You may be wondering, well, I don't see any hope. Or I've been praying for a while and I don't see anything changing. Or, you maybe wonder what's going on in the other person's mind. Well, because of these people's experience and their story, which we'll see right here, is they can give us insights into that. They can help us understand a little bit of the process and the thinking. So let's check this one out. Rejoice Marriage Ministries, they throw up a picture of a hammer, a nail. They're building something. We're not sure, maybe a fence or a door. It says, today's message is from Bob, who was a prodigal from the prodigal son story. If you're new to Christianity, so it's a really popular story. Check it out. I'm sure you'll recognize it even before you finish the story, just from the culture, if you're from a Christian culture. Anyway, who was a prodigal, who returned home and was remarried to me for an additional 23 years before the Lord took him home to heaven. Bob wrote 19 books from the prodigal's perspective for more than 2 decades after our divorce and remarriage. This is written by Charlene, his wife. This is a picture of Bob, and this is his story, The Pain of a Prodigal, by Bob Steinkamp. He writes, he quotes from Proverbs 16:9. In his heart a man plans his course, but the Lord determines his steps. Bob writes, years ago, at about the hour this is being written, I was southbound on the Florida Turnpike, taking an unexpected trip from my far country, another reference to that story, from my far country apartment 100 miles away to the community where I had lived most of my life and where my standing wife and our 3 children lived. He says, I wish I could share some profound thoughts that I had on the trip that ended up with a license, lunch, and getting remarried that very afternoon. He says, I cannot recall a single thought from that morning. He goes on, have you ever seen someone hit their thumb with a hammer? They will often grab the injured thumb and walk in small circles until the severe pain stops. What were they thinking? They were thinking about the pain and nothing else. He says, that was me on that morning of July 7th, 1987. I started my car and headed south, unsure of where I was going. I only knew the pain had to stop. He says, if you think prodigals do not experience pain, you need to go back a few steps in your stand. He continues, I was not so far from God that I could not realize my pain was conviction as the Holy Spirit moved on my sinful life. I was attempting to make deals with God, but He is a God of truth and promise. There are no deals. The day before, I called the county courthouse to see what was required for a marriage license. That should have made God pleased with me. But I woke on that Wednesday morning hurting more than ever. Charlene quickly, this was his first wife, Charlene quickly accepted my lunch offer when I knocked on her office window. Had she refused me or handed me a list of things I had to do before coming home, I would have gone elsewhere in my attempt to alleviate my pain. It is a frightening thing to think that I could have ended that day married to someone else, based on my wife's response to my one question, which was, if we get a marriage license, will you stop praying for me? He says, only in the confused thinking of a prodigal could anyone reason that a standing spouse, that a stander with a marriage license would stop praying for their absent spouse. Yeah, could you imagine getting a marriage license and just being like, okay, I'm satisfied. They're not home, but that's cool. So he says, I can barely recall getting the license, but I can recall, as if it were yesterday, the lunch that followed, with our mighty God speaking to me. You've made the worst mistake of your life. Make it right today by marrying her. Why did I marry Charlene? Why did I remarry Charlene, he says? It is what God told me to do. Listen to this part. This is really interesting. It is what God told me to do. It was not out of love, nor out of need, but it was because God told me to, in order to stop the pain that was overwhelming my spirit. The Lord was right. That night, sleeping in my own bed with my wife at my side, I enjoyed the best night's sleep in years. Praise be to God. What had changed about my wife? Well, nothing, but everything, all at the same time. If you had asked me at lunch on the life-changing day for our entire family, I might have mumbled something about not being able to push her buttons any longer. That one thing was only a trait of the total work that God had done in the wife of my youth. Above all else, Charlene did not have to tell me that she had changed. She allowed the Lord to bring about circumstances and events that demonstrated these changes without her doing a thing. Her changes took place over 2 years, and they continue to this day. Neither she nor I are the same two people who remarried that July afternoon. Charlene and I know people who have been standing for their marriage restoration for more than 10 years. Yeah, you may think, 10 years. Don't worry. But God continues to refine, to reveal, and to reshape that precious group even now. They are taking one step, one day at a time, towards a restored marriage. Standing with God for marriage restoration is a process that takes varying degrees of time. Charlene and I want you to be following Jesus and not us. We will always do our best to be an example for you and to encourage you, but it is Jesus who needs to do his work, first in you and then in your spouse, regardless of the time involved. Finally, your beloved may be in the position I was in, with so much spiritual pain that the only option is to go home to God and a praying spouse. Each time we hear a stander being reminded by some well-intended person of the prodigal's free will, he says, I have to chuckle. The carpenter, he says, who was holding his thumb and walking in circles, has the free will to keep on working, but he doesn't. God has 1,000 ways to bring each of us into alignment with his will, regardless of our free will. In my life, spiritual pain overrode my free will. The next steps may be small and the days long, but God alone brings prodigals home. God heals hurting marriages, their logo. And they end with a quote from Isaiah 48:3, which says, I foretold the former things long ago. My mouth announced them, and I made them known. Then suddenly I acted, and they came to pass. Because he lives, Bob Steinkamp. The suddenly is something that has almost become a coined term with this ministry, and it comes from this verse. It's the idea that we pray, we seek God, we, go through the steps to grow, mature, continue to know him in a new level. And he gives us promises. He announces things. Um, and I haven't like gotten that promise from God in some special way. I've just done a lot of videos, and my own research has produced these videos on the controversy of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And what do the scriptures say? There's a lot of people say that it's a business contract. Other people say no. There's something called a marriage covenant. Some people say, well, there's certain things that relate to marriages as far as oaths and oath keeping, about keeping our promise to God, to our spouse. People talk about forgiveness. What's the essence of Christianity? And they look at a lot of different things. Of course, other people say, yeah, well, what about all these other practical needs? What about some of these other theologians? What about some of these exception clauses? What about 1 Corinthians 7? What about... And so I try to look at that because I had to sort through that on my own. I really felt like God spoke to me through that whole process, and I tried to just put some details together for you, some resources, because I know a lot of you may be a lot more busy than I am. I don't have children, and so I had a little bit of extra time, whereas you may not have the time to go and do the research on the same level. I thought it was good for me. I thought it would bless others. And I really just want to see, I think, John 17, Jesus really talks about and prays for us as Christians to be united. And that when we're united, that people will really see, they'll get a good picture of who God is. I think that's good for everybody in our community. That's good for us. And, but the divorce rates are pretty staggering. And in a lot of countries, as I travel and as I talk to people, it's real rough. It's a real rough deal. I don't know why it's so difficult, but it sure seems like it is. One of the reasons I love these people so much is they're an example, a shining example of two normal people that got remarried not so much out of love, not so much out of their own greatness or, some fairy tale kind of thing. It was the conviction of God. It was the help of God to just hear and obey. I mean, that's essentially what started. As they go on, things really, they had a restored marriage in emotional ways and other ways. But anyway, I'll let you guys check out the site on your own time. Hope you all are well. My prayers for you always. Just keep running your race. God will reward you. We'll talk to you next time. Bye.